Welcome to this session on reporting from the front line. My name's Lindsey Hilsum. I'm the international editor of Channel 4 News. I'm the only person on the panel who doesn't work for The Guardian, although that was, when I was a young journalist, that was the thing I wanted more than anything else, I do recall. But I have had the pleasure over the years of reporting alongside, I think, everybody on this panel. We have Suzanne Goldenberg, who is now the US environment correspondent, but Suzanne and I worked together in Iraq in 2003, and you were in Georgia, I remember, at one point as well, weren't you?
I was in the Caucasus before that.
Yeah, that's right.
A decade before that, nearly. Yeah.
Right. And India and all over the place. Ian Black, who is Middle East editor, who has also been diplomatic editor and correspondent and reported from, well, primarily the Middle East, but all over the world as well, haven't you?
Mostly the Middle East.
Mostly the Middle East. Emma Graham Harrison here, who is a newcomer to The Guardian, only been working there for a month, and they recruited her very wisely, if I may say, in Afghanistan, where she was the Reuters bureau chief. And previous to that, Emma worked for Reuters in China, which is where she and I met, and I can tell you she speaks the most beautiful Chinese. It makes me very jealous. Martin Chulov is the Middle East correspondent for The Guardian. He lives in Beirut. He spent 3 years in Iraq before that. And like Ian and myself, much of last year across all the Arab awakening, Arab Spring, Arab uprising, whatever you want to call it, phenomena of Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, and so on. There's so many issues that we could talk about. I know that one of the issues is about the danger of what we do. The other is, why do we still do it? What is the point? In the time of YouTube and citizen journalists, what is the point of these people going out to these places? Reporting for The Guardian as opposed to anyone else. What's the difference? All of these kind of issues. So what I'm going to suggest is that each speaker will talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So, Ian, I'm going to turn to you, but I think you're the dean of our press corps here, so I'm going to go to you first.
I've played the age card, so I'm going to just say a few words at the beginning, and I agree that we should just make a few introductory remarks. I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, and that should be interesting. I was thinking what to say at this session, and as I thought about it, I realized I wasn't just thinking about the last decade, as is billed in this program, which obviously has been a very busy decade, certainly since 9/11 and the wars of 9/11, and an extraordinary past year, of course, of the what we call the Arab Spring. But I found that I was thinking back much further to slightly unable to believe how old I was and how long I've been doing this. And I was thinking that, you know, I've actually been visiting front lines of different sorts for 35 years, and one thing that's occurred to me was that they come a front line, a war, an insurgency, a state of insurrection. These front lines come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and for me, in a way, it remains the most powerful memory of my fairly occasional forays into the sharp end of war reporting, going back to the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. And you have to be above a certain age to even remember that. And for me, as a youngish correspondent working in the Middle East, it did leave a very powerful impression. This was a war that went on for 8 years, from 1980, when Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, and went on for 8 whole years, probably killed 1 million people. And it was a war that took a tremendous toll on both those societies. But in the Middle East, Iraq in the Arab world, Iran just beyond it, a Muslim country, and really had very little impact in the West. And I still remember it, being stunned at seeing what looked to me, having grown up in this country, you know, in Europe, it looked like a sort of a Middle Eastern version of Flanders Fields, of trenches and artillery barrages and huge numbers of soldiers and equipment, underground bunkers, sudden offensives in which one side or the other would capture maybe just a few hundred yards or a couple of miles to claim victory, until it was taken back in the next round. And what was interesting about that was that it was a huge conflict. It was fairly remote. It was very little direct interest to to the west. It was two countries that were both fairly unpopular in the wider world, and they were slugging it out in a very bitter and very bloody conflict until they sort of petered out in exhaustion. So that was, for me, the biggest conventional type of conflict that I've ever seen, and it did leave a lasting impact on me. But I've also been involved, and I'm sorry I keep using the first person and saying I, but inevitably one has to reflect one's personal experience. But then again, very different experiences of smaller events, but of no less significance. A series of Israeli-Arab wars and incursions. I remember perhaps the first thing I ever covered of this kind was in the late 1970s, the first big Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which was part of a series of events that are still going on, of course, to this day. And I know Suzanne, we can make an interesting comparison. I covered the first Palestinian uprising, the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, which was an event of enormous significance, but it was, on the Palestinian side at least, it wasn't an armed insurrection, but a largely peaceful protest. The War of the Stones, that was a war too, but the weapons were stones. The next time there was a Palestinian uprising, Suzanne will talk about that, it was a very different story. So again, these conflicts come in different forms, different shapes and sizes. To be honest, I'm a little bit suspicious, a bit iffy about this concept of war reporting as such. I mean, of course, like anything, there's a degree of specialization. You know, it helps to know a bit about weapons, you know, what sort of aircraft are being used, or is that a drone, or is it a helicopter or a fighter? Can you identify the sound of heavy machine gun fire as opposed to something else, or recognize the flash of a rocket-propelled grenade, which is very much used in the sort of lower level, lower intensity conflicts that we've seen. But a lot of it is no more than observation and common sense and experience. You don't need to be a strategic genius. For example, in Libya last year, Martin will have seen a lot of this too, that a few days after NATO started bombing Gaddafi's tanks and heavy artillery, you started seeing units of Libyan soldiers just in jeeps zooming along the coastal road in the direction of the rebels. You could work out what they were trying to do without being a really battle-hardened expert. So some of it is obvious. Central to all this, I'm sure we'll all talk about it, is you'll remember the First World War poet Wilfred Owen, who coined that wonderful phrase about the pity of war. Death, injury, danger. Increasingly in the conflicts I think we've all been involved in, we'll all talk about too, civilians who are the principal victims of most of these things. What else matters? It matters to keep the habit, the standard journalistic habit I think all journalists should have. I'm sure we would all agree, of asking questions and not accepting too much at face value, particularly when you're involved in a conflict where there are always going to be two different versions of the truth that are very hard to reconcile. And the old saying about truth being the first casualty of war, title of a wonderful book some of you will know by Philip Knightley about the War Correspondent. That's as true as ever. Well, the risks. Well, we sadly all remember only recently, only last month, that our friend and colleague Marie Colvin was killed reporting from Homs in Syria, along with a French photographer. So that was a very bitter and terrible reminder of what can happen. That speaks for itself. Lindsey talked a bit about the risks and why we do it. I mean, I think everybody has their own motivation, but what everybody has in common is a sense that you have to do your best to try and tell the story of people who can't do it for themselves. And Marie's death was a vivid and horrible reminder of that. I know Martin will talk about his time recently in that area too. Of course, so part of the whole thing is this idea of bearing witness, of telling the wider world what is going on. Though, again, as Lindsey said at the beginning, this is changing to some extent because of the changes in technology, which are so much part of the lives of all of us, but particularly those of us in the media. When I was in Syria in January, I went to Syria with with a visa from the government. I was allowed into the country. A few journalists were allowed in. So I was there officially and not in an undercover way, but I was able for one night to slip away and with the help of brave people in the Syrian opposition to get from Damascus to a town called Zabadani, which is about 25 miles away, and to see a town which at that time was in the hands of the Syrian opposition, the rebels, or whatever you want to call them. And yes, there were men there with guns from the Free Syrian Army who were really protecting the people who were out protesting the nightly demonstrations to express their opposition to the Assad regime. And yes, there were people with guns, and yes, there was a lot of, the atmosphere was very militant, but what there was most of all were very, very large numbers of people with cameras and phones who were busy photographing everything in sight, particularly the demonstrations, and uploading them onto the internet so that their uprising, their revolution, whatever you want to call it, could be seen by the wider world. And that's what they wanted. And I still remember the man who said to me, clutching my arm in excitement, talking about this scene, he said, our most important weapon is YouTube. And that was a fascinating and quite handily succinct insight, if you like, into one of the ways in which reporting on conflicts has changed. Just a couple of thoughts, and that is that you can be in one place as a journalist on a front line in a war, and like a soldier, you can be in this one place and see very vividly what's happening to you there, and you can have long periods of boredom, excitement and terror, but you might have no idea whatsoever what's happening elsewhere. And I think everybody who's done this kind of thing knows that to be the case. And in the case that I've just described, this town of Zabadani, which was exhilarating to visit and thrilling to see these people demonstrating their freedom, but it was a very tenuous freedom because just a few days later the Syrian army, which remains enormously powerful, got its tanks and armoured personnel carriers and its thugs and moved back into the town, and the men with the guns were either captured or killed or ran away. So the moment is interesting, but the moment can be misleading. And the reason I say that is that I think that it's very important for the media, people who do this kind of thing, to remember that what they need to do is to tell as much as they can the whole picture. You can give a snapshot of a place at a particular moment in time and try to convey as best you can, as vividly as you can, what it's like for the people who live there. But you also have to try to contextualize, to tell the whole picture. So in a sense, reporting on conflict, on war, being on the front lines is no different in principle from any other form of journalism. Those are my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ian, I think you have definitely moved with the times. I certainly don't make notes on a BlackBerry. I think that's very impressive. Emma, let's turn to you. You've 6 years in China, which was not a war, although it had its moments. And now, what, 2 years in Afghanistan, 2.5?
3.
3 years in Afghanistan. Big contrast in the kind of stories you're reporting.
Yeah, so I consider myself sort of a bit of an accidental war correspondent. There's some people, particularly in Afghanistan, who they really wanted to cover conflict and its impact. I was sent to help out in Kabul for a couple of months, somewhat reluctantly and quite nervously. There's a great story in China, and it's not. You might get beaten up a little bit, but it's essentially not physically dangerous. And I got to Kabul. I thought I was going to be met at the airport by a guy in an armoured car, with a handgun, and instead there was actually nobody there. I came out into arrivals. I thought, oh right, do I get a taxi here? Do the Taliban run taxis? What do I do? So I kind of wandered out, and in the sort of outer parking lot, because Kabul, like everywhere, in Afghanistan, has many layers of not very effective, often, security, was our office manager. I was working for Reuters at the time, in his ordinary Citroen car. And I sort of thought, oh, is this okay? And he was this lovely, very warm and welcoming man. I got in the car, because there wasn't much choice, and we drove off to the office, and nothing happened. We got to the office, which was a very nice house. There were security restrictions. We lived there, but for me, that was a big lesson in one of the sort of contradictions of reporting conflict, which is that you only get in the paper when something happens. So people's idea of Afghanistan or anywhere where there's war or violence is bombs, attacks, but really day to day you can go for months, particularly in Kabul, without anything happening. The first time I was embedded with US soldiers, they taught me this phrase, which I think you guys must all know. They said, war, it's all about hurry up and wait. And, you know, I went off again expecting that I'd be on the front line and there'd be guns and bombs, and in fact, I spent 3 days at an airstrip waiting for a flight out. So, you know, so that's one of the sort of strange things about our job, that actually day to day, Kabul itself, for instance, isn't as dangerous as a lot of people imagine. There isn't attacks every day in Kabul. People like Martin, who report from Syria and places like that, where there is really a much higher pace of conflict, I think will have a very different experience. But for me, Kabul is it's not a war zone. It's a very dangerous place where there are attacks and bad things do happen. But I don't think living in Kabul, I live in a war zone. I go to cover bits of Afghanistan where the war is, the front lines are. And, you know, not to say there aren't great dangers to the people of Kabul, but, and just a couple of points about the war in Afghanistan, because that's the only war I've covered. I can't really speak about any other conflicts. It's a particularly lopsided war. We have incredible access to the Western troops and almost no access to the other side. My colleague Gaith, who is braver than me, has been on reporting trips with Taliban a couple of times in Afghanistan, but has also been kidnapped. So, you know, that speaks to the dangers of trying to go and get the other view. I think because of the nature of having British troops on the ground, a lot of what you see in the papers and particularly on the TV is what's happening in Helmand, whereas a lot of what's actually deciding the future of Afghanistan is the politics that's happening in Kabul. And again, it's a sort of contradiction of what you're trying to report. It's often the news is the explosions and things, but the long-term future of the country is the politics. No war is safe, but relatively speaking, if you're restricted to embedded reporting in Afghanistan, it's probably one of the safest ways to do war reporting. You are going into incredible danger, but the Americans have an extraordinary medical evacuation system. There's medics on every patrol. If something does happen to you, your chances of surviving are much better than, for instance, I don't know if any of you know Tim Hetherington, who was killed in Libya. You know, I don't know the exact circumstances of his death, but, you know, possibly if there'd been more medical treatment available immediately, him and the other journalist, Chris Hondros, might, well, something like, you know, it's you have medical resources that in a lot of war reporting you don't have available. And I would just, it's a very intense war from a media point of view. There's so much resources invested in Afghanistan that there's a very heavy focus on what's happening there by governments in the West that you don't have in a lot of other places where you have conflict. And sometimes a lot of what we do is very sad and frightening and difficult, but also there's sometimes moments of farce. The Al Jazeera correspondent in Kabul was thrown to the ground by an explosion the other day. He got up ready to report, and it turned out that the boiler in the next door house had blown out. And I was just getting ready for bed a few nights ago and heard a huge explosion and then sort of little crackles that I thought were gunfire. I thought, oh my God, middle of the night, attack, get everything ready. I got ready to go outside, looked out the window and I saw fireworks reflected in the windows of the house opposite, because it was the Persian New Year. And I looked at my watch and it was midnight and felt very stupid. So, you know, it's not, there's sort of stranger moments as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. Martin Chulov.
Hi, good evening everyone. I've been reporting from the Middle East for the last 7 years now. The first 3 years was in Jerusalem and Gaza and also in Lebanon. From there I moved into Iraq. At that point the Guardian were looking to reopen their Baghdad bureau and they wanted someone to do it, and I went and did that. And I was just thinking as Emma was speaking, my arrival to Baghdad was very different to Emma's arrival to Kabul. I remember walking out into the car park and there were 6 guys with Kalashnikovs and magazines being clicked in and thrown into cars and speeding down a road. And that was how the story was being reported back then, but I was sent back with a different brief. And that brief was to get amongst the community, to you know, reclaim an insight into the humanity of Iraq. It's no point investing heavily in a place like Baghdad to reopen a bureau, and it is very expensive to operate there. And just doing the death and mayhem, the grinding misery, there's plenty of that, but there's also a society that's been through generations of trauma, and what's being left behind, and that was the brief. And I was tasked with travelling around Iraq as much as I possibly could. And I always had that initial instruction, never lose sight of the humanity, very much with me. And we tried very hard to get into the communities, to see the legacy of 30 years of sadistic oppression, followed by 12 years of war and sanctions and an invasion and everything that happened. And by the end of 2010, the rest of the region was starting to rumble on, and this was the stirrings of the Arab awakening that have swept all of us away for the last 18 months, and certainly been the most extraordinary time of my career. I think Lindsey and Ian would say the same. It's just it really has been. It was almost a pipe dream in some ways, because the initial phase very much was about people who realised that they no longer had to accept the status quo, that they did have a role in determining their own destiny, or they could have one, and they were prepared to fight for it. I mean, all of these revolutions that we've been to have been different in many levels, but there are some common currents. And what we've all been through in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of being on the front lines of these particularly violent places at times, has been a means to an end. I mean, I don't see myself as a war correspondent. I don't want to be that. I work in a region where war and violent things happen, but the societies themselves are extremely important. Their stories are essential to what we do, and the Gurdian formula is very much to find a simple story which speaks to a much broader narrative, and that's what we've tried to do, just tell the story of these Arab Springs through original voices. And that's brought me to Syria, which is where the rules are starting to be rewritten again. By far and away, it's the most difficult story I've covered in my 18 years as a reporter and 10 years in the field. We sort of have, as correspondents, we sort of have an additional role in Syria, because there is not much scrutiny. I mean, the government does as best as it can to keep out NGO workers, governments. They're very manipulative. They do like to shape the agenda. All of that is fine, but we as correspondents are increasingly being seen as dangerous subversives in Syria. Marie certainly was, and I've no doubt that Marie was targeted by the regime, no doubt whatsoever, because of the powerful work that she was conveying. It was very much in the regime interest to lock down Homs. She provided a window to the world. She was true to her commitment, and she was a very brave woman, to bear witness. And we've all been like that in Syria, and it's been a difficult place in which to operate. I was across the border, if you like, behind enemy lines recently, and we knew very well that the regime were looking for us. And just the way we had to work there was unlike anything I've had to do before. We had to be very disciplined with our communications, because they're a perfect way to find out where we are. I'll never forget the family that were hosting me in the town where I was. They knew very well the risks of having a correspondent there. I knew very well the risks for them as well, but it was something that they were absolutely prepared to do, because they thought that the benefit of having me there was much bigger than the cost of not having me there. And when I left that town 3 weeks ago now, after spending 12 days living with these people, they had nothing. We were eating their eggs and potatoes. There was no food, there was no money, there was no water, there was nothing at all. They were giving me everything that they had, and I was eating with them, and I was eternally grateful for it. But when I did leave them, there was the crackle of gunfire nearby. There was shelling. It was a dangerous drive to the border, and I wondered at that time, would I see them again? And I still wonder that, and I think that when I do go back to this town, whenever it may be in the next couple of months, I'll be very surprised if the people that hosted me are still there. And that's something that we think about all the time as correspondents, and it's just the way that things have worked out in Syria, and it's something that shapes my thinking and will continue to shape our coverage this year.
Thank you, Martin. Suzanne,
Thanks. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been really interesting for me to listen to my colleagues describe their experiences, because some of us have reported from the same areas, some regions, some from the exact same conflicts. And what I've learned over the years is that there are some similarities, of course, but every conflict is different. And for me, what I just wanted to tell make a couple of points. And the first was to describe, again, an arrival story. So I came to the Middle East in 2000, at the beginning of 2000, to be the correspondent in Jerusalem and to cover the region. And I can remember then, that was the era when there was still hope for the Oslo peace process. We still thought there would be a two-state solution. And I can remember sitting around with the other journalists, and they said, "Why did you come here? You're going to be redundant. The story is over. Nobody's going to care." I would say mid-2000, there'll be a peace agreement, game over. Well, that March, there was a sort of violent protest. And by that September, there was the beginning of the Intifada. And until that time, I mean, there still was this peace process sputtering along diplomatically. And people, what is called civil society, which is basically the ordinary people on both sides, but who have a will to make peace and to connect one with another, we're still going back and forth to each other's homes. For example, to do grocery shopping, I would drive to Ramallah, which was about 15 minutes from my house. And the reason for that was because at Ramallah, they would bag your groceries. They would put your groceries in the car. I would go next door and have a Turkish coffee and a baklava. And it was much more congenial than doing my grocery shopping at the Supersol on near Bedegran. Although it was 24 hours, that one. But anyway, and it was just, no one thought about it. On Saturday night, you would go out to Ramallah from Jerusalem because there wasn't the Sabbath, there was more going on. Well, once and these distances were so small, I mean, it was a 15-minute drive to Ramallah. But then came the Intifada in September 2000. Those short distances, because of the checkpoints, because of the danger, they became huge, and they became chasms between the two peoples. And what for me was how corrosive and horrifying was to see those connections that had begun to be made between Israelis and Palestinians, how they withered, and how that fed the bitterness and fed the conflict. And you had people saying, on the Palestinian side, they would say, "Oh, well, my friend in Jerusalem, they haven't called me. They know there's been an assault in Ramallah and nobody's called me." And you'd hear Israelis say the same thing. "We've just had a suicide bombing. I don't see those people I've been going to peace meetings with for days on end to come and, offer condolences." And that, to me, that whole process of seeing these distances grow was really horrifying to see. And at the same, perhaps as horrifying as the violence, because what happened is that it did begin as a war of stones, but there was gunfire on the first day, and it quickly became more and more violent. And it was a situation in which there was no easily defined front line. There was certainly not a fixed front line. So, and because the Israeli army would block the roads, we would go out and drive alone on roads or back roads and just asking people for directions. And I can remember, times where you didn't really know if you could get through or not get through. That road might have worked a day before. You'd be calling somebody on your cell phone saying, "Did you get through on this dirt road? How did you do it? Was there a tank there?" And there was no front line. Everything was shifting every day. And I think those things, the lack of a front line and the lack of boundaries about how people would treat one another, those to me were the defining moments of that conflict, and things that I've seen replicated in other conflicts. I mean, for example, in Iraq, once the Americans came in, they began to put up the same kind of barriers, physical barriers that I saw being built up in Ramallah, and those kind of things. So to see this sort of shifting of front lines, the inability to decide what is safe and what is not safe, that I think is a hallmark of conflicts today. And I think that's why they're more dangerous. The other thing, the point about, no red lines, nobody protected, no respect for doctors or medics or clerics, that's something that I think we as journalists have to be very conscious of. And even more, I think there is a greater burden on us now more than ever before to do no harm. The last few conflicts, we have seen people who have lost their lives because they were working with foreign journalists or helping foreign journalists, whether they were drivers or volunteers or whatever. And I think finally, I think we as journalists are becoming more appropriately conscious of our obligation to do no harm to the people who work with us and who help us to tell the story. And I'm so glad to hear, you know, Martin acknowledge us and acknowledge those fears, because there's been so many people who helped me along the way, and some of them I'm still in contact with people that I met and who I stayed with in Georgia and the former Soviet Union, and the little boy's grown up to be a doctor, and so that's really nice to see. But there are a lot of people I wonder about, and I would hate to think that anything bad happened to them because of me.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. So very varied experiences there, but with some common threads. So let me open it up for questions. Has anybody got any questions? Yes, lady here.
Yeah, I'm a bit curious about this. They talk about the CNN effect, about how reporting from the front line to somewhere sort of like the UK, where we don't sort of experience the sort of deaths and things, how you keep it relevant, and do you find that people, as you report a story, as you're in a country, when you report about these deaths and what's going on, do you find that sort of reactions back home, do they sort of, people sort of, the first few are always obviously very, sort of people are aware of them, you hear of deaths and you're shocked by it, but do you find the shock goes, with the reactions to shock, the deaths and horrors go as the stories progress?
You mean people sort of get tired, they get sort of compassion fatigue?
Yeah.
Do you mean your audience or you as a person?
The audience.
The people reading.
I don't, is that, just that, you know, I never know when you know, as a journalist and someone who's done it for very many years, I have no idea I can't predict accurately what will make a big impact and what won't. And one story for me that I wrote that people, you know, I found out much later had a lot of resonance with people, really wasn't about horrific violence. It wasn't descriptive. It was describing this lady in Baghdad who was Kavlamis. I think I used it, that's her real name. It wasn't in the article, but it was before the war and everyone was waiting. Where Saddam was still in charge, the US invasion hadn't started yet. And no, it had started, but they hadn't taken control. And we were waiting for things. And before the war started, I'd gone to their house. They'd made this fabulous river fish for dinner, and it was their husband of art. Her husband was an artist in this great community. And a few days later, I described going back. They're hiding in the basement. They have no electricity. They're whimpering. They're horrific and stuff. So that, for people, really brought home how precarious their life had become, how scary it was, and how utterly destroyed they were, and how little control they had over their circumstances. And up to that point, they were unscathed. And I guess I was surprised because nothing horrible had happened to them yet, and yet it had a huge resonance. So I find people do react to things in ways that you just can't imagine.
But that was because people identified with that family, didn't they? They thought, this is a family who sounds like us. That could be me and my auntie and my husband and my mum. But
that's your job. Your job is just to make people connect. That's all you can do.
It's when you can't go to the supermarket because it's been blown up, or the school bus doesn't come because it's been used as a barricade. People will remember perhaps Maggie O'Kane, our colleague. She reported from the Balkans, from Bosnia in the 1990s, I think very, very effectively. Yes. And one of the things that she did was she just talked about ordinary people in Sarajevo who were like us, who kind of wore jeans and liked rock music. But there was a sniper in the apartment block opposite and they couldn't get across the road. It was that kind of stuff, I agree, has
one of the best bit of war reporting I ever read was the late, great Martha Gellhorn, who in her 70s went to Panama and needed to go to the hairdresser. And so she wrote this piece about trying to find a decent hairdresser in Panama City, and this was when there'd been, you know, Noriega had been lifted by the Americans and it was complete chaos and so on. And through this story you learnt so much about how people lived, and that maybe is the best way to keep up, as what you say, so people don't get this compassion fatigue. More questions? Nobody has any questions. Yes, you have a question.
From sort of my point of view of looking at, in particular, the Arab Spring, but also maybe going back a little bit before that as well, the most sort of searing, most iconic things that I think about are the sort of the TV images, you know, whether that's the Saddam Hussein statue falling down, or whether that's, I forget the girl's name tragically, the girl who was shot in the neck.
Nida.
Nida in
or
Iran.
say Gaddafi's body or something like
Yes.
that. The TV images.
Yes.
How is it? What are the challenges of print journalists, I guess, to sort of tell the story in an effective way?
Yeah, well, let me first of all say that is why you have to watch Channel 4 News as well as read The Guardian. Of course, let me just get that.
Can I talk about the statue? Because I was there.
Let me put to Martin first and then come, because we were both,
That is indeed a challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, people do, these iconic images resonate, no doubt about that. You know, I think this institution increasingly believes that as important as they are, and you know, we must cover them wholeheartedly, the way to make our mark is not necessarily to want to directly compete with those visuals, because the TVs are over us all the time. They're always going to get the jump on us. So, you know, I think it just goes back to the formula which Susie was talking about, and myself was earlier as well, and that is to find that quintessential story which speaks in words to that powerful bigger narrative. And I think that that's the way forward for this place, because it is a point of difference. As important as those images are, we have a slightly different role, and that is to, you know, to dig a little and to provide cues for other people to follow themselves. You know, I think we have to be different from the wires, and in order to make ourselves, to make our brand continually viable, we need to produce original, compelling material. So, as important as they are, they don't necessarily guide us. Our task is to look for separate stuff.
Suzanne?
I just wanted to add the thing for me, as someone who was there on that day, the thing for me that was always strange is that area, Firdosh Square, was not a major area in Baghdad. It was nothing. And it just so happened to be, and there were many, many statues of Saddam, and this certainly wasn't the biggest statue of Saddam. It just so happened to be the statue of Saddam in front of the hotel where the journalists were staying. But it wasn't accidental. I mean, the U.S., it subsequently emerged that the U.S. Army, you know, sort of deliberately put the people in. No, they had started and they could, but they brought in the crane.
But they brought in, they brought in the Hauser and they
brought in the equipment and they brought it down. And a year later, James Meek and I sort of deconstruct that event a little bit. But even afterwards, they brought out. So if you remember, there was the rescue of the soldier, the heroic rescue of Private Jessica Lynch, and that was you know, a totally constructed and contrived image. This was another one that was totally constructed and contrived. And again, I would bring it back to Martin's point, is that that's why you need print reporting. That's why you can't just, what you see is not what you get.
But also, why? I mean, because it's very interesting, because I remember I was in the hotel as well with Suzanne, and my editor kept calling me and saying, you've got to put more of the statue in the piece. I said, oh, bloody statue, it's the Americans, it's not a big deal. He's saying, Lindsey, you don't understand. You don't understand. I'm here. I'm the reporter spot. No, I'm the editor. I understand. This is the iconic image. And he was totally right, that it was the iconic image. And I was there, and I didn't get it. I didn't understand. Because I thought, because I thought that the people I had spoken to during the day and the things I got were much more interesting. So it's strange that sometimes an image like that gets a resonance around the world, and you can be there on the spot and not quite feel as it has the same meaning. Let me ask Emma a question here, because you've been from a wire service, Reuters, and now you're with The Guardian. So what would be the difference in the way that you do stories for a wire service and the way you do a story for The Guardian?
Well, with a wire service, your primary concern is speed. You're competing with other wire agencies to get the news out first, ahead of everybody else. I think that's increasingly important for newspapers in the age of the internet. But you know, the kind of old cliche was that you go to a press conference at the presidential palace or whatever, they'd say something, the wire agencies would run back to their office, and the newspaper and other journalists would go and enjoy the like free buffet and lovely wine and stuff. And so, and it's also sort of relentlessly 24 hours. You know, there's always someone awake wanting to read Reuters news. There's always someone awake wanting to read The Guardian. But you know, in general, there's a sort of filing deadline for the paper, and you can't cover as a wire agency, you have to cover every major story. At the newspaper, the editors will make a decision, which for me has been great. You know, when there's been 2 big stories, okay, you focus on this is our priority, and we can take the other story off the wire. There's also, I suppose, a little bit more room for you to follow, because you're not dictated by the news of the day, of having to follow that news cycle. You maybe have more time to dig into stories, to go into things in a bit more depth, to perhaps look for the stories like Suzanne's that will touch people and tell the story in a human way, but aren't the day's story of the body count or the sort of facts that will feed into other people's newspapers. Although it's worth mentioning that as newspapers, because of the online world, are getting more wire agency-like in terms of wanting short stories and then a longer update, wire agencies are also trying to diversify to compete. So Reuters is now putting a lot of money into investigative journalism and trying to do the type of reporting that would once have been the preserve, really, of newspapers or magazines. And, you know, I mean, that's a sort of separate discussion of how the internet's changing.
Yeah, but it affects all of us, because in all of the reporting we do, we all have websites now. So on the Guardian website, you've got video, you've got audio, you've got text, and on the Channel 4 News website, the same. And so some of these divisions are breaking down, I think. Yes, more questions. Over there, gentlemen, and then...
As we've got so many experts on the Middle East, and you have to go where the action is, do you foresee at some stage in the medium future you're going to be flying into Iran and eventually into Saudi one of these days?
The journalist as prophet. Right. Who wants... It's a mug's game, you know. Journalists should never speculate. But go on, I'm going to get Ian too, because...
Thanks, Lindsay, thanks.
Well, with your breadth and depth of experience...
It's difficult business, isn't it, predicting? It's true. It's a gut feeling, okay? No more than that. Don't hold me to it. My gut feeling is that on Iran it's very difficult. My gut feeling is that there won't be a war over Iran, because I just think it's just...
Inshallah, as they say.
Inshallah, as they say. Because it's just too difficult, because there's, particularly in the United States, for a whole variety of reasons, because of the history of the last 10 years and Iraq and Afghanistan and so on and so forth, the idea of a military attack against Iran, I think, is just too difficult. The mood music from the Americans is that. The Israelis, who feel most threatened by the strong suspicion, at the very least, that the Iranians are trying to build a nuclear weapon, have been very adept at trying to create a climate in which this can take place. But I don't think that it will end in a war. But on Saudi Arabia, I sort of think that Saudi Arabia will survive, certainly for the moment, in the short to medium term, the currents, the winds of the Arab Spring, for reasons that are to do with that particular society. Largely its wealth, its conservatism. Certainly there are lots of Saudis who would like to see change, but I think that probably with a leadership, a royal family that is mostly in its mid to late 80s, the next generation, the young people in their 60s and 70s who will lead Saudi Arabia next, will probably be smart enough, and they're certainly wealthy enough, to be able to buy off the sort of simmering resentment that in other places, and particularly in poorer Arab countries, have put together the mix that we call the Arab Spring. But I mean, if I'm wrong, as I say, we often say in this room, we have our morning conferences, where we discuss what we're going to do in the Guardian every day, and it became a bit of a joke in the early days of the Arab Spring. Every so often I would very frequently, in fact, it was exhausting. Almost every day, well, what's going to happen in Egypt, and what's going to happen in Bahrain and Libya and Syria? Most days, the next day people say, well, you were completely wrong. So the trick is that you can never be wrong for long, because there's always another opportunity. So that comes with a health warning.
That's what we always say about Sky News in the business, never wrong for long. Does anybody else want to predict the future?
I'm happy with that.
No, we're happy. We're okay. Lady there in the mauve scarf.
Can you talk about the way Twitter's changed the way you're reporting?
Yes.
It's completely changed the way that I consume news. And
Yes.
it's also changed the kinds of stories that are stories. So thinking about Saudi Arabia, like Hamza Kashgari, young guy on Twitter who was then extradited from Malaysia and brought back and imprisoned in Saudi for criticising or expressing ambivalent feelings to profit. But there's kind of stories on Twitter, and then there's the way you report and the way you think about people who consume those stories.
So So let's ask you a little bit more about that first. So tell us, so that's a good example, but what, so you're checking the news on Twitter the whole time, are you?
Yeah, I've stopped. I never read the newspaper hardly ever read the
right.
newspaper from cover to cover.
Okay.
I follow specific stories that I want to follow on Twitter, and it's the kind of expert level conversation on Twitter, and journalists are part of that. But the news is coming out every minute, every hour.
But do you use Twitter to, because you get quite a lot of links to longer stories. Do you use the links and read the longer stories? Or are you getting enough, just like the sort of headlines and emerging story as it goes along? Both. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So that's very interesting for us, you see, to know how it goes. Who wants to talk about that? Martin, Emma, do you have any experience?
Well, for me, Twitter has completely changed my reporting life. For a start, when something happens, you know, you hear a bang or there's reports that there's a bang, you know, traditionally what you do, ring the police, in countries where there is one, the fire service, ring people you know around the city. And now I'd be doing that, but I'd also be checking Twitter because it's quite likely that somebody is near the bang and that somebody is following them. So for breaking news, I find it completely indispensable. I check it all the time. It usually gives you a heads up. I mean, not half the time, you know, sometimes it's wrong, but at least it's a very easy way to stay on top of what's happening, much easier than the old ways. And I also find it quite a useful resource for, essentially, as you say, having expert level recommendations. People filter through all, you know, the mainstream media. Of course, at least I read, you know, the big papers and big websites myself. Every morning I check them, but you know, maybe the magazines that you wouldn't read every issue, the Atlantic or something, that can have great stories. And so it's like having a personal reading list. And I also tweet a bit myself, probably not as much as I should, but you know.
What kind of things do you tweet?
Usually news, but for instance, I tweeted about the fireworks.
Yes.
You know, so it's kind of a mixture of news and life. But yeah, it's definitely, you know, there's a sense that if you don't have a presence on Twitter, you're losing some of your weight or some of your, you know, the authority that you could carry, the influence that you could have with your reporting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the only time I have trended on Twitter, yes, I have trended on Twitter. But it was interesting because what it was the day after bin Laden was killed. I was outside the house in Abbottabad, and I just started tweeting little details. My favourite one being, there's an advertisement for a girls' school painted on the wall of bin Laden's house. And then the kids are selling bits of the helicopter that crashed for 20 rupees each to journalists and stuff like that. And I found that people were really interested in that. So I just kept going, and there were just sort of little observations of what the scene was like outside the house. And that seemed to be something that people were very interested in. Whether it made any more people watch Channel 4 News that evening, I have no idea. Martin, do you Twitter?
No, I'd just add to that, the observational reporting is actually valuable. These little vignettes of things that you see that can't necessarily make anything you write later in the day, people are interested in. You know, they will follow. And also, I'll just add to what the lady said, I find it an incredibly useful journalistic tool for myself. You know, there's the personal reading list. You can select who you follow, and it's basically a filter. It gets rid of a lot of the people whose information is not reliable, and you've got an aggregated digest almost of really usable factual information that feeds into your own reporting. So I find it really valuable.
Let me do a straw poll. How many people here use Twitter for getting their news? Yeah, quite a lot. How many people think that they read less or read fewer longer articles now because they're using Twitter, Facebook and so on? Or does okay, anybody here read fewer longer articles? No, you all. Oh, you do.
But the key thing, I mean, the question is, do you click through? I mean, Ginny here needs to be said. Ginny is a great expert on Yemen, so it's interesting that Ginny is such a strong advocate of Twitter. But I wonder, is there a distinction? Look at Twitter, but then do you read the link, or do you just read the 140 characters? That's interesting. Yeah. Is it just very, very succinct, or is it a gateway into something?
So how many people tend to use it to get to the longer article? Yep. Yeah. Seriously. Most of you do. Well, you're Guardian readers, hey. That's what we expect. Any more questions? Yes, you've got gentleman over here and then the lady there.
I'll just ask, it's much easier.
Yes.
You're all foreign correspondents. I'm concerned about democracy in this country for various reasons. Do you have any thoughts, coming from where you come from, coming from the outside, as it were, about what's going on in this country? I hear, and it's probably rumour, that some of the demonstrations have had D-notices slapped on them recently. And I also hear that some of the security provisions that are being put into the Olympic Games will actually be kept on afterwards. Now, this may or may not be accurate, but it does have implications. So I just wondered if you had
I'm not sure you're asking the right panel here.
No, I know.
Because I don't think, because we don't cover this country, so I'm not sure we can.
I'm asking you, when you come back into the country after a time out of it, do you? I mean, fine, I accept what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's sort of, on the sort of verifying of rumours and so on, I don't think that we're the right people to do it. Let me go to the lady there.
Living back to the conversation we just had about Twitter, how do you use social media? Probably, I guess, social media and Twitter you might be using as another eyewitness account when you're not able to get hold of the information directly. The reason why I'm asking is because when I did my master's degree in media communications, one of the thesis was about Neda as well.
Neda, yeah. Neda, for those people don't know, Neda was a demonstrator in Tehran after the disputed elections of 2009, who was killed on the streets. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the reason why I picked her story was very interesting because I wanted to see how information travels along the different media channels. And I spoke to a blogger who at the time was based in Iraq and covering, all the stories in Iraq, and he also covered her story, and asking him how he used social media to use it as another eyewitness account. Also speaking a bit about reliability, how do you go about reliability? How do you go about, is it a reliable for source, but also information that say a Twitter account is posting on? How do you verify?
Yeah. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, like most people here, I use Twitter a lot as for the links, and I use it just to talk to people back and forth, but I would never ever take any fact that I saw or any statement, assertion that I saw on Twitter at face value. There's just no way. I mean, I would, so then I guess it's somebody saying, hey, did you hear?
Unless
right, and saying it very quickly.
Yeah,
unless it's like Reuters breaking news, or but I would, and even then you would, if it's Reuters, you would quote, you would say Reuters said, that's a Gurdian rule that we don't, or you would say where that information came from, if it was sort of a known news organization, a well-regarded news organization, or you would phone up, if they say there's a bomb in the police station, you would phone up and see if it actually was there. So you would have to verify.
There's a big issue for the Guardian website in particular. Some of you will know perhaps our live blog, which is very, very popular. It's been enormously successful on the back of the Arab Spring, the Middle East live blog, which we now do every single day. There's a particular issue which is quite problematic. It relates especially to Syria, where we talked about this before. There's so many YouTube videos being uploaded that appear to provide very often very graphic and usually on the face of it convincing evidence of things going on. It's very hard to verify them, but quite often there are ways of doing it. Circumstantial evidence, different videos. You can do it, but it's hard.
We do that, but I mean, it's actually quite important. I mean, we on Channel 4 News, we do a lot of this stuff. We actually now there's a new kind of journalism which is coming up. There's an organisation in Dublin called Storyful, and they specialise in examining these YouTube videos that come up, and to see whether they're true or not. Now, there are various things. There's the weather. You can check the weather. Is the weather as it appears, and so can you tell that the day is right? The circumstance, the place. You check geographical features and so on. Has this person put stuff up before? All those kind of things. And I have an example. A couple of weeks ago, I got a video from the Free Syrian Army saying these 5 Iranians have been killing women and children, and they were confessing to killing women and children. So we looked at this, I thought, hello. And I got a Farsi speaker Persian speaker in, and she listened through, and she said, some of these phrases are Arabic translated into Persian. It doesn't sound right. And also they're clearly under duress. And then somebody else, Anita McNaught of Al Jazeera in Turkey, put out a tweet saying, we've got this video of these 5 Iranians in Homs. Anybody know anything about it? Within 10 minutes, somebody had come back to say, those 5 Iranians were telecommunications workers who were kidnapped in January. And this is the newspaper in which their picture appears. So then so within the space of about an hour, we could tell that this video was not what we had been told it was. So there are ways of verifying things or unverifying things, but you know, it's quite a lot of work. You have to be very careful. Yes, lady there.
Can I ask the sort of, if you like, the counter to what you've been saying, because I don't follow Twitter. And
yes.
I have no time to, apart from anything else.
Sure.
I'm too busy actually living.
What's that? We have no time for that.
but how do you make? I mean, I'm an avid consumer of the print version of the Guardian. I love the print version of the Guardian. I think it's an artifact that gives me an enormous amount of pleasure every day.
Right.
And how do you make sure that people like me don't get kind of left out? You know, how do you make sure that you don't make us feel that actually we're unimportant and we're not.
Do you feel that?
Sometimes, yes, because there's this kind of conversation going on about, oh, everything's on Twitter and everything's really wonderful, and if you're not, and I'm just frankly not interested. And I love reading I read the Guardian from cover to cover every single day, and that's what I want to do. And I want you to keep giving me a Guardian that I can read from cover to cover every day.
Okay, so we're being told we've got to stop. So I'm just going to get one comment each from the panel, and sort of on that, which is that in this kind of very kind of pressured reporting that we do, conflicts and foreign corresponding, can you do, what's your priority? Is your priority the tweet, the Facebook, the bit of video you've been asked to do, the podcast, or writing the article? Can we all do everything? How do you? You know, maybe I'm old school, but I just wish there were more of you. I really do. I still think that the number one priority for me is to tell that gripping story, which you will find in print, even if it's after you find it on the web. It doesn't matter; it's still there for posterity. And just to that point of difference, a piece of reporting which helps people understand and potentially makes a difference. So, to that end, I think we'll continue to serve what you're looking for. Emma? I'd agree that ultimately, if you want to try and explain a country or get some kind of connection with it, it's your reporting that will make that connection. That's why people click through on Twitter. But I think if you're aiming to reach as many people as possible with the story of the people whose story you're trying to tell, that wasn't very well phrased, but that's why I'm not on TV. It's important that you use things like Twitter. So, I mean, I would say they're secondary, but they're very to the main reporting, but they're very important. Yep. You know, I don't know if you've been to any of the sessions about the future of the media or the future of the Guardian. You will know that Alan Rusbridger, our editor, has really been absolutely a pioneer in the whole question of the digital future of the media. And with all the difficulties, I think everybody acknowledges the role that he's played in that. And Alan has said from the beginning, I mean, this is a revolution that has now been going for quite a long time, but he said from the beginning, and I think it's a very important statement, that we must never sacrifice quality for speed, because there is this emphasis on speed and on all these different outlets that we're supposed to use. And you know, I'm with Martin. I mean, I think that our job is to explain, to report, to explain, to contextualize, to make sense of things that are happening, often in remote and distant places, for the audience that we know exists here. Even though the audience is changing too, because it's not just you who treasure your newspaper, but it's also those 60 million people, for goodness sake, who now use our website every month. So we have to do both. But okay, I'm going to have to move on to Suzanne, because I'm getting some really filthy looks. Yes. I just wanted to say that I'm sort of with Martin and with Ian. I mean, for me, the priority is the big piece. I mean, that's what we as journalists really, I mean, that's what I live for. That's what makes the job worthwhile. I tweet, and I tweet quite a lot, but very often I consign stuff to Twitter that I don't want to write about and that I don't think worthy is writing about. And actually, that's something that Alan envisaged, that some stuff is only worth a tweet. Some stuff is only worth a blog post, but you save your best stuff for the big article and the long read, which is in the paper and on the web. Thank you very much. And I have to say this, or you can write a book, which I have just done, which is available in the Guardian shop. Great. very much.